Good morning, church family. I hope that your weekend has been a good one. If you're a college football fan from the state of Alabama, you probably had a pretty good day yesterday. If you're an Arkansas fan or a Mississippi State fan, you probably didn't have a good weekend so far. So since the last week of April, we have been studying a comparison of the four Gospels. We have come to the point where we are about to approach Christ's final week. He's about to approach Jerusalem. I started this study because I was trying to develop a chronology of the events in Jesus' ministry. And when we talk about the last week in a chronology, trying to line those events up in a chronological order is a very difficult thing to do in that last week, and there are many reasons for that. I've kind of skipped 2 slides. So let me back up for a second. Last week we left with Jesus leaving Perea. He entered Judea near Jericho. He entered Jericho where he healed some blind men, and then he had dinner with the tax collector, Zacchaeus. This week we began with Jesus leaving Jericho and getting ready to enter Bethany with the goal of entering Jerusalem for the final week. And this is where I was getting to a few seconds ago. So trying to develop a chronology for that final week is difficult for many reasons. And the top 3 reasons are here on this slide, and we're going to spend most of today discussing the backgrounds for these 3 reasons so that for the rest of the class you'll understand where I'm coming from on certain events. So the 3, like I said, there are many reasons why this chronology is difficult. By the way, the authors give us clues, but how to interpret those clues is what's difficult. And having a background in these 3 areas, and as well as other things we'll talk about during the week, will help you understand those clues. So the 3 biggest reasons is our method of counting. We count differently today than they did 2,000 years ago. Now you might at first go, what do you mean we count differently? And I'll explain that in the next couple of slides. The second reason is defining when does a day start. Today, our modern concept of when a day starts is midnight. Day starts at midnight, it ends at midnight. And we've been used to that for a long time, actually since 46 BC, when Julius Caesar started that process. But that's one definition of a day start. It's not the Jewish definition of a day start, and we'll go over that in a couple of slides. And another reason is the Jewish calendars, particularly the Jewish calendars as they relate to the Passover events. We all know at this point that Jesus' crucifixion coincided with a Passover. But it can be confusing because if you read the Bible carefully, there were 2 Passovers that were celebrated in that last week. And we will get to that point. But the reason that there were 2 Passovers is that there were 2 Jewish calendars in event. And we will talk about that here in a couple of slides coming up. So any questions before we move on? Please, if you don't understand something here, stop me and ask the question, because some of this stuff can be confusing, and we need a good background in this in order to understand the whole rest of the class. All right, counting. You would think that counting should be an easy thing. We've been counting all of our lives, and we've been counting the same way all of our lives. But the way we count has changed over time. And it all has to do with the concept of a zero. Now, today we accept a zero, no problem. It's part of our education. Any elementary math instructors, teachers in the room? No. In class, at least half a century ago when I was in school, we had number lines. The earliest number lines did not have a zero in them. They had negative numbers, they went to -1, and then they went to +1 and went on. And we're going to discuss here for the next 2 slides the history, if you will, of zero. Let's start with 2000 BC. There's no reason to start with 2000 BC other than that was approximately at the time when Abraham was walking on the earth. Now, keep in mind, 2000 BC is before Moses wrote the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. So we're talking about a real long time ago. But in 2000 BC, neither the ancient Egyptians nor the Babylonians had a true zero. They both used a placeholder, and that placeholder was nothing. It was literally blank in their texts, but they didn't have a true zero. At about 1450 BC, and this was about the time that Israel's exodus from Egypt, none of the Middle Eastern countries or civilizations, cultures, used a zero in their texts. At about 400 BC, a symbol for a zero first appeared in calendars in the ancient South Americas. So yay for America, we were the first to actually adopt a zero in our numbering systems. And that occurred about 400 BC. At 30 AD, at about the time that Jesus is conducting and starting his ministry, there was no concept of a zero in the Middle East. I repeated that for the top of this slide. At about 130 AD, so long after John wrote his gospel, you start seeing the first appearance of a zero in Greek texts. At about 458 AD, you start seeing a zero in Indian texts. And at about 525 AD, you start seeing a zero in Roman texts. The Chinese followed about 690 AD. And by about 1000 AD, 1,000 years after Christ, you start seeing a zero is universally accepted around the world. So there was no zero at the time of Jesus. What is the impact of that? Well, before we talk about the impact of that, let's go back and read Scripture and talk about the predictions of Jesus' predictions of his own death. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, you may recall this is about the time he's in Caesarea Philippi. He's got his disciples around him, and Peter has made his confession that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Jesus has made a statement about, get behind me, Satan. And then, after all of that, Jesus predicts his death. And this is a quote from Matthew 16:21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Now, that's not the only place where this on the 3rd day comes up in Bible texts. All of the Gospels have the 3rd day comments. I've forgotten how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in the Gospels. Well, that makes sense. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 15 also repeats that comment about on the 3rd day, Jesus will rise. So let's do the math. And let's start with our modern concept using our zero and the way we count today. Jesus died at approximately 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, at about the time the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. So that's 3 o'clock on Friday. On 3 o'clock on Saturday is day 1, and on 3 o'clock on Sunday is day 2, and on 3 o'clock on Monday is day 3. So Jesus died on a Monday, right? Oh wait, that's not what happened. So that's how our modern counting occurs. That's the way we count today, and that's why this statement can be confusing. But let's go back and count the same thing using, no, I'm still on the right slide. Let's go back and count using ancient counting methods. So in Jesus' time, the day that something happened isn't day 0, it's day 1, even if it's only a fraction of that day. So Jesus died at approximately 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and according to Jewish reckoning, that day ended at 6 o'clock that afternoon or that evening. So there was 3 hours left in Friday, but Friday is now day 1. Saturday, any part of Saturday, is day 2, and then any part of Sunday becomes day 3. So Jesus rose on the 3rd day as predicted by Jesus and recorded at least 9 times in the New Testament. So that's one of the reasons why tracking in the events is difficult. The concept of a 0. Does that make sense to everyone? I see no one shaking their heads, so I assume that that's grasped, okay? Good, because that's the easy one. Now let's talk about when does a day start. Let's start with the Jewish concept, because the Jewish concept is biblical. And let's start with the Bible. So the Jewish system goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Moses wrote the Torah. He wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and he did that at approximately 1450 BC, so long time ago. In Genesis 1, that sets the start of the day at sunset. You scratch your head and you go, well, I don't get that. I don't remember that. Well, let me remind you. Genesis 1, verse 5. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. So evening first, then morning, first day. A Jewish day starts at sunset. Sunset's approximately 6 o'clock in the northern hemisphere in the evening. And the day goes until about 6 o'clock roughly, depending on the day and the time of year. And that's a Jewish day. And of course that phrase is repeated in Genesis chapter 1, verses 8, 13, 19, for each day of the week. So first you have the evening, then you have the sun. That's when the Jewish day starts. What about our modern concept of a day? The Romans established our modern system at approximately 46 BC. That's under Julius Caesar. They had a different system prior to Julius Caesar, but he set up a new calendar and he set up a new start of the day. And his definition of the start of a day was at midnight. So how do you detect midnight under that kind of a concept? Well, the Greeks had been using the sundial to establish the exact occurrence of noon for about 400 years before Christ. So they knew exactly when noon started using a sundial. Subtract 12 hours or add 12 hours, and you now know when midnight is. So midnight is a calculated time based on the reading of the sundial the day before. Does that make sense? Okay. And the Romans began to start the new day at midnight. So we've got this modern concept, day starts at midnight. The Jewish concept is it starts at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening when the sun sets. So that makes sense? Because that's another easy one. Here comes a hard one. Jewish calendars. So it may not be clear, but at the time of Jesus, and even today, existing today, there are two sets of Jewish calendars. The original calendar, two sets of calendars. The original calendar goes by different names depending on different scholars, etc. You call it the original calendar. I don't particularly like that because it's not the original, but the original is one name for it. The creation calendar, because the calendar was established in Genesis at creation. So you can call it the creation calendar. You can call it the Mosaic calendar. That's my preferred. Mosaic coming from Moses. Moses, at God's direction, established this calendar approximately 1450 BC during the Exodus, or shortly after the Exodus of Israel from Egypt. And it's also called the pre-exile calendar for reasons which I'll get into in just a minute. So there are many different names for this original Mosaic Jewish calendar. At the time that the nation of Israel was hostage, if you will, to Egypt, Egypt had two different calendars. They had a solar calendar and a lunar calendar. Now, as you might guess, the solar calendar is based on the sun and 365 and a quarter days in a year. And the Egyptians used this solar calendar for all of their governmental, administrative, business type of events. But they also had a lunar calendar, and you might guess that their lunar calendar was used for religious events. Now, they had multitudes of pagan gods, but they arranged those events based on a lunar calendar, which is based on the positioning of the moon. Now, the Egyptian lunar calendar considered the new moon as the first day of the month. And we're all familiar with the full moon. The full moon is the big, bright moon that sits low on the horizon on the eastern sky just after sunset. So you go a half an hour after sunset, go out, look in the eastern sky, and just above the horizon you've got the full moon. Sometimes it's a red moon. It's the pretty moon. It's the one that everyone talks about. It's when the werewolves come out and howl. And if you work in an emergency room, it's the time when all of the accidents and the crazies come out. I used to work in an emergency room for a while, so I'm familiar with that concept. But we're all familiar with the full moon. The new moon is just the opposite. It's the dark moon. It's the one that's not lit up. And it is almost impossible to detect with the naked eye. Can't see it because it's between Earth and the sun. And so the part of the moon that's being lit up is the part that is away from it, and the rays of the sun are really blocking our ability to detect the new moon. I'll get into more on that in just a minute. So when Moses wrote the Torah at God's direction, he established this original Jewish calendar. Genesis chapter 1 starts the day at twilight, as we've already discussed. Exodus chapter 12 establishes the month of Passover and the Exodus from Egypt as the first month in the Jewish calendar. And it also names that first month Aviv or Abib, depending on your pronunciation of the Jewish word. I prefer Aviv, but you may see it written many places as Abib, A-B-I-B. So establishes Passover as the first month. Numbers, chapter 10, chapter 28, verse 11 and verses 14, establishes the first day of the month as the day of the new moon. Now, as I discussed a few seconds ago, detecting the actual day of the new moon is a difficult thing to do, and in a few slides we'll go over how you actually detect that first day of the month. Keep in mind, they didn't have computers, they didn't have electronics to tell them, all right, today is the start of the new month. They had to detect it, and then they had to report that throughout all of Israel. So there were whole groups of people that were in charge of detecting the first day of the month. So this becomes the original Jewish calendar, or as I called it, the Mosaic. That's my preferred, the Mosaic, or the creation calendar, or the pre-exile calendar. The pre-exile calendar is probably the technically most correct name for this calendar. And this calendar was in use by Israel from the time that the calendar was created, about 1450 BC, all the way up to Babylonian exile in approximately 600 BC. So it was used for quite a while. In the New Testament, Jesus appears to have used this calendar, the original Jewish calendar, in his observance of the Passover. And we'll talk about, when he met in the upper room with his disciples, I have been waiting eagerly to eat this Passover meal with you. But Passover is Friday, or Friday evening, right? But he's eating it Thursday. Is it a Passover meal? Well, it is according to this calendar. Okay? So Jesus is observing a Passover that night with his disciples. Others who used this calendar at the time of Jesus and even today include conservative Jews, the Essenes, which is an interesting group of Jewish people we'll talk about later. Turns out that if you read the clues carefully, the upper room that Jesus chose for the Passover was most likely in the house of an Essene. We know that because of the man carrying the water jug. In the Jewish days, women carried water jugs. Men didn't carry water jugs, with one exception, and that is the Essenes. In the Essenes group, the men carried the water jug. So when Jesus tells his disciples, go find the man carrying the water jug, that's a strong clue that that was an Essene. And where is who else? Oh, and the Samaritans. The Samaritans, as you may recall, let's go all the way back to northern Israel, the 10 tribes that broke off from Judea. They were captured by the Assyrians and they were dispersed. Some of them remained, some of them returned. But the Judeans, the folks from the tribe of Judah, no longer considered them, Jewish is the wrong word, Hebrew. So they became Samaritans, and as we've talked about earlier, many of them settled in that area between Galilee and Jerusalem. So they have some Hebrew background, but the Judeans, the Jews, the ones that returned from Babylon, did not consider them Jewish. In fact, they hated them. And probably rightfully so, because they came from the northern tribes, and what did the northern tribes do? Quote, they did great evil in the sight of the Lord. All right, so those are the folks that used the original or the Mosaic calendar. We talked about the full moon. This is the new moon. This was obviously taken by electronics, cameras, etc. It was also taken just prior to sunrise. But it's dark. It's impossible, almost nearly impossible to see with the naked eye. So how do you detect a new moon? And I think I actually get into that in a slide or two. Pardon me for a second. We're going to come back to the original Jewish calendar in a second, but we're going to switch over for a second, for now, and talk about the modern Jewish calendar, also known as the Babylonian calendar, also known as the post-exile calendar. And I have C handout, and I'll talk about this handout at the end of the slide. If I could get one or two, I think I have enough. Have we taken account today of how many's here? Not yet. It's not on the board. All right, so the tribe of Judah and whatever was left of the tribe of Ben and a few of the Levites were captured by the Babylonians at 597 BC. They were captured. They were taken to Babylon, and they stayed there, according to the Bible, for about 70 years before they were allowed to be released in groups sporadically back into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Turns out the Babylonians also used a lunar calendar. Remember, without electronics, without computers, etc., the moon was a good way to keep track of time. The Babylonians used their lunar calendar, and if you will note that in the modern Jewish calendar, the calendar they use today, the calendar they used at the time, the calendar that the chief priests, the temple priests, used at the time of Jesus, the names of the months are strangely similar to the names of the Babylonian calendar, the calendar that the Babylonians used, and actually do come from the Babylonian calendar. That calendar is very similar to the pre-exile calendar with two major exceptions. One, the names of the month were changed, or are different. But the second one is the first day of the month is not the day of the new moon, because that's almost impossible to detect, but it's the day of the first crescent after, the waxing crescent, if you will. Everyone get a handout? Good. It's the day of the first crescent after the new moon, which is typically 1 or 2 days after the new moon. So you got two calendars, both lunar calendars, both running about the same, but they're 1 or 2 days apart, depending on which month and which year that you're talking about. Now, who uses this calendar? When the tribe of Judah and Ben and the few Levites that returned back to Jerusalem after 70 years in captivity, the chief priests were not the Levites, as you might have expected, but they were members from the tribe of Judah. During the period of the Greek occupation, if you will, those chief priests were from the the Sadducees group. But after the Romans came in and Herod was appointed the king of the Jews, then Herod replaced the Sadducees with the Pharisees, and they became the chief priests. It's the chief priests, the people who run the temple, who are using this Babylonian calendar. They've been using that calendar from about 357 BC, and the new modern Jewish calendar, according to your handout that you have, is still using remnants from that Babylonian calendar. So at the time of Christ, and even today, the temple priests use the Babylonian calendar, while conservative Jews and Jesus use the Mosaic or pre-exile calendar. And the impact of that is that Passover was celebrated on 2 different days amongst the Jewish population. This has been a problem for quite a while, and was such a problem that when Constantine established the Roman Catholic Church, he had to make a decree that he had to split Easter from Passover because every time he went and asked a Jewish community when was Passover, he got two different dates because there were two different calendars. And so he actually split Easter from Passover and declared that it would always be on a Sunday. Prior to that, they celebrated Easter based on when Passover was occurring. So it was a problem. It's not so much of a problem today because Israel has adopted this modern Jewish calendar today, and there are few people that use the old calendar. This handout I handed was taken from the website. I've noted the source down at the bottom. It's been adapted for purposes of this class. If you take a look at it, you see the second column is called the Academy. That is the Academy of the Hebrew Language, which was established by the Israeli government in 1953 to be the supreme institution for scholarship of the Hebrew language. This column has the names of the month of the current modern day Jewish calendar, which also just happens to coincide with the Babylonian calendar. These are all Babylonian names, or words that are used as names. One thing to note, and it's pretty self-explanatory with possibly the last two rows. Normally there are 12 months in a year, but we're all familiar with the concept of a leap year. In a leap year, we add a day or so to our February in order to make up for that. But since their months are 29 and 30 days, after a few years, they need to add a whole month into the calendar in order for it to line up with the Earth's rotation around the sun. So they add a whole month, and they add it between the 11th and the 12th month. And so you see down in the second to last row, Adar 1, that's the month they add during leap years. And the row after that is called Adar, or it's called Adar 2. It's Adar during the regular years and Adar 2 during leap years. If you look in the third column, you see OT. OT stands for the Old Testament. And you'll see that there are 4 names there. Those 4 names come out of the Bible. They're sourced in the footnotes there. You see the first month is Aviv. Sometimes it's Abib, depending on how you translate the ancient Hebrew. Second month is named Ziv. You'll see a date for the 7th and 8th months. The second one, the name is listed there because it's listed in the date which Solomon started building his temple. And you'll see the 7th one. That one is named because that was the date when Solomon finished his temple. And the 8th month was named, or is included in the Bible because that is the month that they dedicated the temple. Other than that, the names of the other months have been lost to us. There are several Jewish writings which suggest that the names of the months were simply numbered, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. It's not in the Bible. I didn't include it here. Don't even know if that's true, but that's what Jewish writings include. Any question on this? Okay. Any question about Jewish calendars? One last thing before we go on then. So the impact here is that in the old pre-exile Mosaic calendar, the first day of the month is the day of the new moon. But in the Babylonian or modern Jewish calendar, the first day of the month can be detected by looking at the sky just prior to sunrise in the east. You will see what's called the waxing moon. And you can see that first crescent. Now the day before, also looking just after sunset, you can also detect the waning moon, which is the day before. Here the crescent would be on this side. So you can detect the day before, you can detect the day after, but you can't detect the day of. So again, this is one of those things where you detect the day after, and then you calculate backwards, and the chief priests declare, okay, yesterday was day one. So go out and tell the rest of Israel that that yesterday was day one, today's day two. But actually, by the time they see this, it's it's really day three before the rest of Israel knows when day one occurs. All right, one last thing while I still got a little bit of time left, is all this has to do with Passover. So what is the timeline of Passover using the Bible as our text? Passover is described in Exodus 12, in Leviticus 23, and Numbers 28. The timeline is outlined here. The Passover lambs are selected on the 10th day of the first month. Now, if that's the creation or Mosaic calendar, that's Aviv. If you are following the Babylonian calendar, that's Nisan, but it's the 10th day of the month. Keep in mind that the 10th day of Aviv and the 10th day of Nisan are two different days, a day or two apart, depending on the month and the year. The lamb, once it's selected, is separated from the herd, and then it's slaughtered at about twilight. According to the text says at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. Again, that's Aviv or Nisan, depending on which calendar you're running by. In practice, because the 15th day of the month is a practice Sabbath day, they don't want to be doing a lot of work on that day, so they want to make sure that the lamb is slaughtered before sunset or approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. So they start the slaughter at about 3 p.m. Thus, that's when the Passover lamb is killed. That is about the time that Jesus died on the cross. The rest of that timeline is after the lamb is slaughtered, it is cooked and it's eaten that night, which is the start of the next day, according to the Jewish calendar. And that's also the start of the day of unleavened bread. The festival of unleavened bread is a 7-day festival. If you add the Passover day in front of it, it now becomes an 8-day festival. So you got 8 days of festival, the Passover day plus 7 days of the festival of unleavened bread. The time between the selection of the lambs on day 10 and the slaughtering of the lamb is called the preparation of the Passover. And that is referred to several times in our New Testament text, and we will talk about that not next week, but in a couple of weeks from now. So I've thrown a lot of complicated, non-biblical information at you. Any questions? Or comments? Questions, comments, statements?
They broke the legs of those that were still living because Sabbath was coming at 6 p.m. We know that for a fact.
Yep.
Jesus was already dead.
Yes.
He was already dead on Friday.
Yes.
So he was dead Friday, he was dead Saturday, and he was, by our terminology,
Rose on Sunday.
day 4, day 5, day 6. Sunday morning, our Sunday, that, from 6 p.m., it was the first day of the week.
The Jewish reckoning, right.
Our Saturday. In fact, the Amplified Bible says in Acts 27, on Saturday night, the disciples came together to break bread. It wasn't Saturday night, it was their first day of the week.
Correct, yes, yeah.
But if we count, he was dead on 3 different days.
Right, died Friday, he was dead on Saturday, and he arose Sunday morning.
That's what is important in all of this.
Roger that, yep. Which was, if you do the math, it's probably less than 48 hours, but it was 3 days under ancient Jewish counting.
Being the evenings, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Having this as a background to help you understand what's going to happen in the next couple of classes.
Yeah, looking at this, the lamb was slaughtered day 1 in preparation, consumed on day 2.
Correct. Under Jewish reckoning, it was slaughtered on the 14th, and it was cooked and eaten on the 15th. All right, let's get set up for worship services.